But for more, let's speak now with retired Lieutenant Colonel Daniel L. Davis, who is Senior Fellow with Defense Priorities. He's joining us from Washington, D.C. this morning. Colonel, thank you so much for joining us. First of all, I want to get your thoughts on our top story this morning. The EU leaders agreeing to partial Russian oil ban. Not a done deal yet, and not what the EU originally set to do, but how significant is this breakthrough, and would it still be as effective in pressuring Russia?
Well, I think it's going to be certainly a lot more effective than anything they've been doing so far, at least in cutting off a large portion of the Russian oil that's coming from the oil income that's coming from the European Union. But the thing that I worry about is that that's a double-edged sword, and the consequence to the European economy could potentially be more severe than the impact on the Russian economy. The intent and the hope is that this will put more pressure on Vladimir Putin, make him stop supporting the war, or make him want to have a ceasefire or end the war in some negotiated form. And I frankly do not see that under any circumstances. I think if that's their hope, the European Union is going to be sorely disappointed, because if anything, this is probably going to make Putin press even harder, because the consequences to Russia won't be felt for many, many months. And what they need to actually operate right now, they have plenty of it, whether it's fuel or ammunition or any of those kinds of things to prosecute the war. So I think that the European Union is probably going to be disappointed with how this turns out over the long term.
Yeah, let's talk more about the repercussions. Is the oil ban the best way to punish Russia? What are your thoughts on, for instance, high tariffs on Russian oil imports instead, and possibly using those revenues to rebuild Ukraine?
Well, we have to first of all, ascertain what we're trying to accomplish. Are we just wanting to punish Russia for what they've done? Like, all we want is a penalty to be imposed on them? Or are we trying to achieve some sort of outcome? Because if it's some sort of outcome, then there's probably some things we have to do differently, because what we're trying to do has, like I said a second ago, it's a double-edged sword, and it's going to cause as much pain on the West as it's going to cause on Russia, and it's not going to influence their effectiveness. What I think we should do, which is what I've been saying actually since before the war started and every bit of the time through it, is we need to, as the West, be putting as much emphasis on diplomacy and trying to bring the parties together for a settlement as we do in just putting in weapons. Because I'm telling you, from a military perspective, the possibilities that we will help Ukraine win the war and push Russia out is not even feasible for the foreseeable future. And attempting to will only drive up the cost to Ukraine in destruction of its cities and the deaths of its people. So I think that diplomacy is where we should be putting a little bit more effort.
You've talked about weapons, Colonel. But we've been hearing optimistic statements from Western leaders that Western promised heavy weapons will soon help Ukraine stop the Russian advance. I want to get your thoughts on what you thought about Mr. Biden's remarks that the U.S. won't supply long-range rockets that can hit Russia. How much of a setback is this for Ukraine?
Well, I think that's pretty telling, because that tells you that Biden's primary interest is in making sure that this war doesn't escalate. And that's a good focus to be on, because the last thing we should be doing is taking risk that we could potentially escalate the war and maybe even cause NATO to be drawn into it, which would be catastrophic if the NATO with nuclear weapons clashes with Russia with nuclear weapons. That could be catastrophic for mankind. And that must be avoided at all costs. So I think what you're going to see is maybe that it's going to start to dawn on the Ukrainian authorities that, there's not going to be a magic end to this, meaning that unless the West says, OK, we're going to give you all of our frontline equipment, there's not even really the realistic possibility that all the weapons that have been promised up to this point are going to change the tide of the war. And let me just point out that virtually everything that's been offered by the West, to include the U.S. howitzers, are second-line things or things that have been taken out of the inventory. They're not even in the active inventory of the Western countries. And that tells you that they're getting the scraps and they're not getting the best stuff. But that's a note that all you're trying to do is help them defend themselves, but you're not providing the capacity for them to even theoretically drive Russia out, which is what Zelensky wants. And so you have a mismatch between the aspiration and the physical capacity, and it's just not going to line up.
Colonel Davis, NATO's Deputy Secretary General, has now said that the alliance faces no restrictions. They have a right to ensure every square inch of NATO territory is protected. So what do you think deployment will look like in Eastern Europe, given these comments? Is this going to change the complexion of the war?
Yeah, I mean, there's never been any question that NATO has complete right and freedom to defend every inch of its territory. Every leader has said that unambiguously from well before the time the war started, and that's not going to change now. But it's a different question when you're saying how much can we involve ourselves in the war between Ukraine and Russia, and that's where you have some risk that has to be weighed very carefully, because each of these NATO nations and the alliance as a whole has an obligation to its people not to bring war onto it. I mean, the whole purpose is to defend it and to deter enemies from attacking, but not to take risk or gambles that could actually draw us into a war. And that, as bad as it sounds, that has to remain the priority, even though Ukraine would love for us to go in, and Zelensky's been trying us to get no-fly zones and involve ourselves in every other way. But we just can't do it because it's not going to succeed. It's not going to save Ukraine, and it could expand the war. We simply can't do that.
Really appreciate your expertise this morning. Thank you very much for joining us. Retired Lieutenant Colonel Daniel L. Davis, Senior Fellow with Defense Priorities.